Hello, welcome back to Animated Literacy. This is the third part of the overview and research that has guided the program over many of the years of its implementation and development. In section number 1, we talked about the role of emotion and prior knowledge in attention, motivation, memory, and comprehension. In section 2, we took a look at the simplified little books that have dominated reading instruction for the last 150 years. We also looked at the fourth grade slump that unfortunately many children face. In the early grades, their books are simpler, the vocabulary is not very wide, and their books are highly predictable. In many cases, they've got pictures that help the children guess at the words. Then about fourth grade, the vocabulary explodes, and there's many words that they've never seen before. There's very little, if any, picture support, and many children hit that fourth grade slump and graduate high school still not reading any better than they did in fourth grade. So everything that we're talking about and have been talking about in animated literacy is designed to help children avoid that fourth grade slump and continue to read and be successful in school and in their lives outside of school for the rest of their lives. So one of the questions that is frequently asked is, when is the earliest that we can start reading to children? Because the studies have shown over and over again that the single most important thing parents can do to help the children in school is to read to them from quality books at home. A study that helped to determine that was one that is reported on in the book Baby Minds. And in this study that was done back in I believe the 1970s, there were two researchers who asked a group of pregnant women to read Dr. Seuss's book Cat in the Hat aloud 2 times each day for 6 weeks before the birth of the baby. So each day, mom would simply pick up Cat in the Hat twice during the course of the day, pretend that the baby was on her lap rather than in the womb, and read the book aloud. Then, after the birth of the babies were brought one at a time into a laboratory. They were propped up, and a tape recording of mother's voice reading 2 different books was played. On one tape recording, mother's voice read the story of Cat in the Hat. On the other tape recording, mother's voice read another rhyming book that was similar, but one that had not been read to the children prior to birth. What the researchers wanted to know is, can children recognize the book that was read before birth? Can they differentiate between that book and a different rhyming book? And are they still excited by that book that they've been hearing twice a day for 6 weeks? So in order to determine that, they put a nipple in the baby's mouth. They connected the nipple to a computer that measured the intensity and frequency of sucking, because babies tend to suck hard and fast when they like something and when they're interested in something. So in the study, when the tape recording came on of mother's voice reading the book Cat in the Hat, the babies instantly started sucking hard and fast. When the tape recording came on of mother reading an unfamiliar rhyming book, there was no change in sucking. So clearly these babies preferred and recognized the book that was familiar, and they loved repetition. They wanted to hear it over and over and over again. And if you've ever read bedtime stories to young children, you know that they will request their favorite bedtime story over and over and over again, just as our daughter did. I would get tired of reading that bedtime story, and so I would try to abbreviate it, and she would say to me, "No, Daddy, read it right. That's not what the book says." So even after she had memorized it, she still wanted to hear that story read over and over and over again. So what we're going to do now is take a look at Dr. Seuss's book Cat in the Hat and contrast it with the simplified textbooks that I was modeling in the last session. When I do this, what I'd like you to do is close your eyes. Many of the books that are designed to teach children to read are really dependent upon pictures for both word recognition and comprehension, which is one of the reasons children struggle when they hit that fourth grade slump and those pictures are taken away. So what I want to find out from Dr. Seuss's book Cat in the Hat is, if I don't show you any pictures and I simply read the text, can you comprehend the book? So close your eyes for a moment, and here are the first couple of pages from Dr. Seuss. The sun did not shine, it was too wet to play. So we sat in the house all that cold, cold, wet day. I sat there with Sally, we sat there we two, and I said how I wish we had something to do. Too wet to go out, too cold to play ball. So we sat in the house, we did nothing at all. Now hopefully you're able to comprehend that without the aid of pictures. And if I show you the pictures, in many cases, you may find that the pictures that you created in your mind are far richer and more interesting than the pictures that Dr. Seuss could put in his book. This is a critical factor when we're teaching children how to read. Another factor that occurred in that book is the book is, even though it is not a song, it is very sing-songy. So it has the elements of a song. The vowels are stretched out and elongated. There's rhythm, there's melody, there's rhyme structure. And what we know is it takes that kind of language to penetrate into the womb before birth. And that's also the kind of language that babies respond to after birth. And it's not just babies that respond to that. This is a quote from the American Stroke Foundation that tells us that one of the only activities that activates, stimulates, and uses the entire brain is music. So music stimulates and helps children develop language even before birth and during their first years of life. And it also, if you're learning a foreign language, it's going to really help you in learning a second or third or fourth language. And if you're unlucky enough to have a stroke or a head injury and you lose your language, music can play a huge role in helping you recover it. Some of you may be familiar with Abby Gifford, who was a congresswoman who, at one of her rallies in Arizona, was shot in the head. And as a result of the injury, she lost her ability to speak. She now can speak fairly well. And one of the reasons for that is because she had a music therapist. And so the music therapist was able to use the elements of music to first train the brain to start to produce songs and rhythmic speech, and then gradually that transferred over to where she can learn to speak again. So music plays a vital role in the early stages, and animated literacy uses a lot of music when helping children. If you think about it, I don't know how many people could recite the alphabet if it weren't for Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. I know I couldn't. There are many children who have autism who have not only learned the alphabet by singing it, but have learned basically daily things like how to feed themselves and how to put on their clothes and various things by simply setting it to music. So music can play a huge role in early language development. Jim Cummins is a researcher from the Toronto area of Canada who has done a lot of research with second language students to see which ones are successful in school and which ones are not, and what are the elements that enable some children to be successful. And what he finds is that we really have two different kinds of language if we're literate. We have oral language, which he calls conversational language, or some refer to it as context-dependent language. Then if you're literate, you also have context-independent language, or what he terms academic language. When we're dealing with context-dependent language, or oral language, or conversational language, very little of the meaning of the words actually comes from the words. Most of the meaning comes from the surrounding environment when we're in a face-to-face kind of a conversation. We have a really good example of this that I read to you in the last session from the Dick and Jane Reader. And if you think about that, how that Dick and Jane Reader was written, the authors of Dick and Jane said that one of the reasons that children may be struggling in learning to read is that the language that's in their books doesn't sound like the oral language that they're used to speaking and hearing. So their purpose was to try to put oral language into a book to make it easier for children to read. So there was no understanding back then of the critical difference between oral and book language. The first two words in that book were look, look, and oh. Now you could carry on an entire conversation in face-to-face communication with just those two words. So imagine I'm out on the front deck of my home, and there's a beautiful sunset, and I want to share it with my wife and daughter, and they're not looking. So I might just simply say to them, Judy, Kimberly, look. And if they're not looking yet, I might repeat it, look, look. Now we may all be looking at the sunset and thoroughly enjoying it, and we might all say in unison, oh, oh, oh. So an entire conversation has taken place with just those two words. But where did the meaning come from? It came from the sunset and the environment, not from the words that were spoken. Along about fourth grade, the pictures are taken out of most of the books that children have to comprehend. So now language isn't used to direct your attention to the context as it was in the example I just gave. Instead, the language has to be there to create the context. So just from the words in the book, you have to see it, smell it, taste it, hear it, be frightened by it, be repulsed by it, be attracted by it, run away from it. All of those kinds of emotional and visual and tactile experiences have to just come to you through the use of words. An example of this is many of you may have had the experience where you've read a novel that has had no pictures in it. And after reading the novel, you go to the movie and you're disappointed. Because even Steven Spielberg cannot put on the movie screen information that is as emotionally stimulating and as beautiful as the kinds of things that your brain can create just from the words in the book. But not all students are able to do that. James Cummins tells us that it takes about 2 years for a child to acquire enough language to be able to carry on a face-to-face conversation. And many of us have had conversations with 2-year-olds, and they can be pretty good at it. And so we might tend to think that that child has mastered language simply because they can carry on a conversation until we go to talk to them on the telephone. And then we discover that when we have removed the common context, those children tend to not be nearly as fluent on the telephone. However, they can still ask questions and we can still negotiate meaning on the telephone that doesn't happen in a book that has no pictures. So our goal needs to be that we develop children to the point that they are able to visualize from the text that they are reading and experience a full range of emotion and senses just through that book. Ronald Kotalik has a different way of talking about this. And what he tells us is that there's a difference between being street smart and school smart. And he goes on to say, when you look at children who come out of terrible environments and do well, you find that someone in their lives somehow instilled in them the attitude that they aren't helpless. Many never get the antidote in time. They are verbally impoverished on the one hand, but are above average in reading nonverbal cues that tell them when others may be threatening or vulnerable, a capacity that has come to be called street smart. When Cummins was studying high school dropouts in New York City, he discovered that many of the students who were second language learners who were dropping out of high school had better oral language skills than the students who were staying in school. So they could go to the mall, they could hang out at parties, and they could talk to their friends, carry on conversations, but they were not able to handle the language of books. And again, Cummins estimates it takes about 2 years to acquire that ability to master conversational language, but he says it takes anywhere from 5 to 7 or 8 years of exposure to book language to be able to process book language and read the book with no pictures in it and go to the movie and be disappointed. So the only way for children to acquire book language is by being read to from books. And here's a quote from How Babies Talk that tells us a typical middle-class child enters first grade with between 1,000 and 1,700 hours of one-on-one picture book reading. The corresponding child from a low-income family averages only 25 such hours. And it's probably that average means that most of them have had no bedtime stories, and a few have had a lot that averaged out to 25. And I was one of those kids that had parents who were not literate, so there were no books in my home, there were no bedtime stories. And so that was definitely something that I had to overcome. And I think I mentioned earlier, I didn't overcome it until my junior year of college when I finally became a good reader. It is not just the words in books that children are impoverished by. Here's a study that was done by Betty Hart and Todd Reesley. That's a classic study where they took tape recordings of conversation in homes, professional homes, working class homes, and welfare homes. And what they found is, on average, the child with professional parents heard 2,153 words addressed to the child per hour. In the working class home, that dropped to almost half at 1,251 words, but in the welfare home, the child only heard 616 words per hour directly to the child. And the difference in the words that children heard was even more significant. In the professional home, children heard lots of positive language. Look how smart you are. Oh, look how you did that all by yourself. Look at that big word you just used. Whereas in the welfare homes, children heard a lot of "don't do that," "how many times have I told you not to do that?" And the language tends to be very negative, so they tune out even the few words that they have an opportunity to hear. One of the ways that animated literacy helps to overcome this is the very first words that children are taught how to read and write, they are also taught how to draw. So in a step-by-step process based on how Mona Brooks teaches in her book, Drawing with Children, children are taught how to draw a picture. Then they're taught how to label that picture. And when you put the label and the letters next to each other over and over and over again, because the child has drawn that picture that represents the meaning of the word, later they see that word without the picture, but they can have formed that picture in their mind that enables them to visualize. That is a critical step in overcoming and avoiding that fourth grade slump. And these are what I just showed in the pictures here are pictures that children did on their first week of kindergarten, where they had learned the sound of P, they had learned the sound of U, and then they learned how to put those two sounds together to read and write the word pup and draw a picture of a pup that can aid in visualization. Then animated literacy follows a developmental language sequence where in the early stages children are taught to read the name of objects. Then at a little bit higher level, they're taught how to read the parts of those objects. And as they're labeling those objects, we're talking about spelling patterns, we're talking about sounds. So rather than using little books to teach decoding, we're using books to teach comprehension, vocabulary, and to provide a challenging environment for children to grow into. So here in our first example, children just labeled the pup. Now here the child is labeling the parts of the pup. Then once children can produce about a 50-word vocabulary, they move from producing single words to producing phrases. So that now they need adjectives and verbs to combine with their nouns so that we can have nice kitty and big pup and pup runs and our two-word phrases. So in order to move children to book language, we need to read a lot of books that are filled with adjectives and verbs. So here's an example of a book, Dog, by Matthew Van Fleet, that has all of this vocabulary in it. And it reads, fluffy dog, scruffy dog, droopy dog sags, perky little puppy dog, wag, wag, wag. And from that one book, we have fluffy, scruffy, droopy, perky, sloppy, silky, shaggy, teeny, slobbery, drooly, smooth. So now we can start to use all of those words from the books that we've read and placed up on a chart to describe the parts of our pup. And then we can also read books that have lots of verbs in them and use those to name how the pup can move and how the parts of the pup can move, so that we are directing children to that book language. And as their drawing and labeling expands, it gets more and more complicated. So here you now start to see some kids who are on the one side labeling an elf, and this elf has a peach face and a yellow shirt and a red cap. And so we're starting to use some descriptive words. On the other side, you have a doll, and this child has labeled the parts of the doll. And then down at the bottom, she's added the word "the" before hair to put it into a complete sentence. And she writes the simile, the hair sways like leaves. And I'll be talking about later how we can train children to begin to produce their own similes. And then gradually they get to more and more complex labeling. So we can do all of our teaching of sounds, are teaching connecting those sounds to letters and to spelling patterns, blending those sounds to form labels, which children are very excited about doing. So we have the emotional input and we have a comprehension taking place here. So thank you very much for joining me in this section, and I will look forward to seeing you hopefully in session 4.